Hey, this is Michael Lindsay from Vital MX. I'm about an hour outside of Bologna, Italy, riding the all-new, and I mean literally all-new, Ducati 450 Desmo MX. So again, we're at Park 04. This is actually a new facility that was bought by Andrea Dovizioso. If you're a big MotoGP fan, you'll know who that is, an Italian legend. Ducati brought us out here. We're about an hour outside of the factory, which is in Bologna in the Borno Panigale district, as a lot of their models are named after that. But here we are, a new 450 in the field, and honestly, we've had a few OEMs step into, into 450s or into motocross bikes the last couple years that haven't been here, but this is the one I am the most excited for. And for a simple reason, there is a little bit different architecture going here. It's gotten really tough with motocross bikes these years, and in talking to their development team, they ran into the same thing. All the bikes are really good that are currently on the market, and not to pat everybody on the back, but simply put, we're nitpicking at times to find things we don't like or things that we think could be improved. And because of that, it tends to seem that most OEMs trend towards the same layouts, the same engines, the same born strokes, all those things. Yes, this bike isn't a massive departure from anything out there, and I'll get into that with my initial feelings, but it does have the Desmodromic valve system. So instead of using a typical cam and lobe or a finger follower setup, it uses basically what looks like two finger followers setups. One controls the valve opening and one controls the valve closing. What are the advantages? Two things. One, less friction than a cam slapping basically a bucket and trying to compress a spring. That motion creates more friction in the engine than this setup. Also, by controlling the valve not only on the opening, but the closing with basically a finger follower or a follower arm, it allows for better control at high RPMs. I mean, they've got, Superbikes, MotoGP setups that can spin, I think, upwards of 18, almost 20,000 RPM with this style of setup. We're not quite that crazy here with the 450, of course, but it does allow for much better control at high RPM. So that is the unique component to bringing this, and there is a few other little details about it, but again, broad impressions, let's start with it. First thing out on the bike, first thing out on the track. Very neutral, very normal. Nothing that I felt like immediately I had to get used to. The rider triangle is always the thing I'm the most sensitive to with a new bike, in particular with a new manufacturer, and I will say they nailed that. To try to compare for somebody, it is very Honda-esque, and as probably anybody that's watched any of our testing videos or anyone else in media, we always kind of quote the Honda as the gold standard for that rider triangle, that foot peg to seat to handlebar triangle, and this really nails it. It feels very neutral. I'm a very medium-sized guy. I'm 5'9", a little bit short on the leg side, a little bit short inseam. So shorter guys usually ride the Honda well, taller guys deal with it well. This feels very much like that. Looking at the rest of the bike, yes, it is absolutely beautiful in my opinion, and all the plastic, everything about this has been fitted together extremely well. I have no complaints on boots, pants, anything catching. There's so much connection point in these side panels into the way it feeds into the shrouds, just everything there, a lot of grip point on the motorcycle. So very easy to get comfortable from that standpoint. Now let's start getting nitty-gritty. What are some of the things that felt a little more unique about this bike? Well, the thing that stood out that makes it different, again, is the engine. And the engine character is different on this Desmo system. The born stroke of the engine itself isn't anything too crazy. It's very middle of the road. It's, I believe, the same as a Honda. It's actually a little bit smaller bore than a Yamaha, but a little bit bigger bore than a KTM. It basically falls right in the middle of what's very typical for a 450. At first, when I knew they were going to run the Desmo system, I thought this would be a larger bore, shorter stroke motor, really try to spin it up RPM-wise, but they kind of kept with a very neutral setup there. However, coming into the Desmo system again, it's a very free engine. I would say it is the most 350-like 450 I've ever ridden. It's very free on spool up. It revs well. Yes, the max RPM rev limit on it is maybe about 500, somewhere between 300 and 800 RPM higher than most of its competition, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it is definitely a 450 that works at higher RPM better than anything I've ever ridden. So what does that feel like on track? It does have a little bit of a softer initial hit. It has decent torque, but it's not really aggressive off the bottom. It feels, again, very unlike any other 450 in that area. It's very linear off the bottom, very smooth. I know we've been saying that, like you talk about the Austrian product from KTM, we always quote that as a linear bike. This takes this to a whole new area of that. So very initially soft, but then quickly comes together. Mid-range through top, it revs so much freer than any 450, but in saying that, it doesn't blow through the power quickly. Like a Yamaha 450 does rev quick, but it feels like it blows through that power really fast. You gotta hurry up and grab that next shift. The gears are extremely long on this. Second gear basically lasts as long as third gear on most other motorcycles. So out here, we're dealing with a fairly tight, very Italian style hard pack hill track. Just able to go forever. The biggest section on the track, this big uphill into a step up. If you wanted to, you can run second gear the whole way up it, like legitimately the entire section. I do shift a third, but I never got out of third gear today. I would venture to say even taking this to Glen Helen, it would be fairly difficult to find a place to get up into fourth and utilize fourth accurately. So the cool part with that is less shifting. You're able to focus on your line selection more. You're able to focus on just overall riding. What is interesting with those gaps though is second feels really long and third feels really long, but they're both very long and away from each other. So it feels like you have to really use up second to get to third. It does have decent torque if you short shift it, but definitely a much softer character than the Air 450. It's not a bike that I enjoyed short shifting, just going from second to third quickly in sections. Not really the way I would ride it. I was really trying to reprogram my brain and treat second gear like third gear on any other bike. That's the easiest way for me to describe how you have to come into this situation. Now with that, if I'm saying second is that long and feels very third, again, how does it feel off the bottom? It is in the really tight corners, a little on the lethargic side, and the mapping is a little bit on the disconnected side. It is a little bit soft down there. It is running currently, I believe, a 1349. I know for sure we're on a 49 rear sprocket. I would initially jump right to, I'd probably bump up the rear teeth, 1 to 2 rear teeth on this, just because I don't use a lot of clutch. So the really, really tight sections on this track, I was struggling with second gear, feeling too low RPM, a little too chuggy and not quick enough responding. Because even though I said it would rev quickly, that's from about 5,000 to 6,000 RPM and up, but that bottom 2,500 to about 5,000 is soft. Again, soft torque there, soft RPM feel. So if you really let it lug down in there in really tight corners on second, it would take a second to come up off that bottom. So I tried first in a few places. I know guys run first gear in Supercross for some big jumps and a couple things out of corners, but I just can't wrap my head around running first gear in corners. It ends up being basically too much at that point. So overall, the positives for me for the engine, again, that makes it unlike any other bike is that very free nature. And that's not only in power building up, but also power building down. We'll get into the electronics package here in a little bit, but even regardless if it's the max or the lowest setting for engine braking, it does have a very free feeling coming back down. So I do enjoy the mid to top on this bike. Again, the most 350 like 450 I've ever ridden. A little bit soft on the bottom torque-wise, but again, depends on the suit you need. There's a lot of people that think 450s are too much. This definitely would suit somebody that nature. Somebody that's really looking for punch right off the bottom, that's looking for deep low RPM grunt and some hit, might be a little bit disappointed. My biggest point with the power is I do overall like the engine. I love the ability to ride it that aggressively, and I love the fact that at that high RPM, it doesn't feel like it has quite as much inertia as any other 450. Typically a 450, even if you can rev it, it doesn't usually feel like a good idea. It feels like the bike very much binds up. It feels like it's basically gonna toss you off at any moment if you just scream the crap out of a 450. This one responds very well to be ridden at a high RPM. So I like it. It feels like you can really maximize the bike. A couple things related to the power that are on my personal distaste. One, I talked a little bit about that disconnection. For me, the mapping is a little bit dirty, almost rich off the bottom. And because of that, some of those small throttle inputs feel a bit disconnected. So I end up with these small lurching moments in hard pack ruts. Makes the bike feel a little pitchy at times. But I did struggle. We tried a few different mapping options. They actually went through one of my bikes to double check it. And yeah, just couldn't quite come to terms with that. But it's not a terrible shock to me. Like first year OEMs, I feel like that is something that comes up pretty often with mapping. And when we're comparing it to most of the competition out there, we're talking about brands that have been doing EFI for 10 or 15 years on a motocross bike. And I do think motocross bikes are extremely sensitive to that 2,000 to 5,000 RPM, and that 0 to 10% throttle opening is extremely hard to get perfect. There are other OEMs in the field that still haven't exactly nailed it, but there are a few brands that I think are a gold standard in that area. And that was honestly, amongst everything, probably my most major complaint or dislike for my first impression of the bike. Moving on into chassis, the track we rode today, very different for me, very Euro, very Italian. And when I say that, it's just marbly, hard pack, a lot of elevation change, not a lot of ruts, kind of wall riding. So I'll be honest, for me, the way I typically ride a bike, loaded chassis, I don't have a lot of comparison there. What I can say is the balance of the chassis itself and the way it ergonomically works, I'm very happy with. I feel like the stability is pretty good, but we also don't have a lot of high load situations on this track. A couple places where you land hard on loading, but not a lot of places where I feel like I am actually loading the motorcycle that aggressively. So that's a little bit wait to be seen. On the suspension side though, still could tell a little bit more. Again, not very rough today, so actual action in terms of comfort or harshness in places, not too much, but overall balance. So like most OEMs, we're talking about a 105 millimeter baseline. I ended up a little bit below that originally. I think at 108 is where they set me. I came back in, still added a little bit to it, turn-wise, because I had, again, a little bit of pitching this morning. This bike definitely feels a little soft to me. A little bit of a surprise because a big claim on Ducati's part is this bike, the engine itself is the exact same spec as what Lupino was racing at the end of last year in Italian championships and what Mattia Guadagnini and Jeremy Soor were racing in MXGP up until last week, and they raced this engine. The suspension package, they said, was extremely close to what Lupino raced with at points last year, and it's definitely a little bit soft and a little bit active. So for me, most of my changes were related to stiffening both ends, slowing down the rebound on both ends, and just overall trying to get a ride height out of it because it felt a little bit soft and pitchy. So most of it was just trying to calm it down, but small inputs. We're not talking about anything crazy. My rebound changes were about 2 to 3 each. My high speed change was only about a quarter of a turn, and compression was within a couple clicks. Also pushed the fork down 2 millimeters, just finding a little bit of balance. I did appreciate that the changes were effective, but not like jumping off a bridge. I feel like that's, you know, a current struggle. Some bikes, you put input on them and it's almost too much. 1 or 2 millimeters of fork height or 1 or 2 millimeters of sag go to good, and then one more goes to basically right off the cliff. So effective, but not too sensitive on that end. Once you get into the electronics, you get into something a little bit more unique again with Ducati. Yes, every OEM has had traction control, or a form of it they call, for, man, Kawasaki's had it for nearly 8 or 10 years. For a while it was hidden in the back end software on the bike. It's been more public between KTM and Honda and Kawi and everybody having it on a handlebar switch. Those systems to me are fairly intrusive, and they're all kind of based the same way. They have an algorithm that runs off of just engine spikes. When it sees the RPM of the engine spool up too quickly, it will retard mapping or change the fuel mapping to reduce the amount of RPM spike. This bike actually, in a way, is able to track rear wheel speed, and there is a sensor you can find on the engine side that I'm standing on the left side of the bike. There's a sensor in the case that basically measures the countershaft speed, and based on what gear the bike is in and how fast that countershaft is moving, they know how fast the rear wheel is spinning. So they're able to judge the rear wheel momentum based off of other sensors on the bike that sense the momentum of the bike, and I believe some sort of G-force. It's basically it dynamically knows how fast the bike is moving and roughly if it is jumping or changing direction. So based on that, it knows if it's jumping so it doesn't cut, or things that make it know it's not driving in a straight line. It's basically gone to an algorithm point where the bike knows if it's exiting a corner, that if it senses a change between the dynamic speed of the bike and the rear wheel, it'll start to cut in some form of traction control. So in my opinion, the only true legit traction control we have in motocross. It has 4 settings. There are different levels of intrusion. I tried each one. On one hand, it is one of the most enjoyable systems I've run. I don't really like anybody else's form of traction control. Again, I think it's too intrusive because it affects too much on jumps and whoops and things of that nature. This was noticeable in the corners. However, the unique part is it thinks so much for itself, or it has so much algorithm to go off of. I do notice it doesn't do the same thing every time, which I appreciate, but in a few cases, the bike, again, would like almost gurgle and run a little bit dirty at times because of the traction control kick in. For my personal preference, the first or the second setting is what I liked. It was effective, but not too much. The fourth one, like pulling up the hill here, I could feel it restricting some of the RPM build, where I actually was okay with the tires spinning a little bit and that RPM picking up very quick up the hill so I could get up into third gear. The higher level of traction control system for me would cut in too much on the uphill, by example, from exiting the corner. The other unique part though is if you like the higher sensitivity of the traction control, but you want to be able to disable it, there's actually a pressure sensor up here in the clutch lever. If you just put a little bit of pressure with your finger on the clutch lever, it will actually disable the traction control system for what I would call a section until it knows it's decelling to go into another corner before it reactivates the system. So it's something if you really wanted to, you'd have to learn in your mind. It took me a big chunk of the day when I was messing around with traction control to remember that I could give it that little bit of pressure input to disable the system. Another very common piece of their electronic suite is the fact that you have mode switches. You basically have baseline, a green and a red light. Baseline setting, green is a mellower map, red is more aggressive, but there's also different things assigned to that. And if you go into their app, it looks kind of like the KTM one. It just has sliders. So on the traction control, you can either have it off or 1 through 4. The launch control can be adjusted, I believe, between 3 different settings. You can adjust the throttle input or aggressiveness, so basically mellow to aggressive map on a 1 to 2 scale. And a couple other and you can do the engine braking control from a minimum to a maximum. And you can, what I love is you can assign those to either map. That's something I've complained about with other OEMs that they don't do that well. So if you wanted to put both maps on aggressive throttle, the same traction control, but you just want to see the difference in engine braking, you can do that. You can assign them each to a different color and have all the parameters the same except for the engine braking. Or you can have the engine braking the same and just do the throttle response. Or you can do all those the same and only test the traction control. So very effective to run through everything on the fly because you can just bump that button so easy and figure out what combination you actually want. Last thing, speaking of electronics, is the quick shifter. I've noted before, I'm not a huge fan of quick shifters on dirt bikes, particularly the one on the Austrian bikes, I have not been a fan of. I thought Triumph did a fairly good job with theirs. The Ducati lands somewhere in the middle for me. It is a bit sensitive to input on the shift lever. The Fox Instincts I wear are a little bit wider, and the team actually mentioned to me when I commented to them, hey, I'm having moments where when the quick shifter is on, I'm feeling hesitation or the bike trying to cut the quick shifter, but not when I'm fully shifting. And the first thing they identified was the boots I was wearing. They basically told me that Jeremy Sewer, who is also in Fox here, has run into the same problem. So if you have a wide boot or you have your toes really far in and you bump the shifter arm where it comes out, you can accidentally engage the quick shifter function a little bit. And I caught myself doing that a few times, so I went ahead and disabled the system. It is effective on starts and in straight line situations, pulling those gears. But I think like most guys that ride moto, I like having my own little personal input there. I would rather chop the throttle a little bit or just use the lever. And I will say their transmission and gearbox is really good as it is. Without the quick shifter on, it does shift well under heavy loads. It doesn't take much throttle change to be able to pull that. Speaking of throttle, another very odd item I found on this is the throttle pull itself is pretty stiff. I know that sounds like a really minor complaint, but I've caught myself either over regripping or instead of being able to twist with my wrist, I was following through with my arm a lot. So overall, it's a very weird item, but compared to pretty much any other bike in the class, I thought that the throttle pull feel was very heavy on this bike. And again, for a bike that revs freely and is soft at the bottom, it's kind of one that you really want to get to that open throttle position quickly to be able to use that spool up. And I felt like I was kind of having to overthink how I got my throttle pull engaged. That was really a minor thing, but something I noticed. Another minor complaint is I love the ergos. A few guys today complained about the grips. I have pretty small hands, so it didn't bother me too much, but they are a very thin grip, so I think you feel the handlebar quite a bit through them. The seat taper I quite like, but it is a little bit slick. Any of the ruts today we had that were like a hook rut or going up the hill, I just had those moments where basically I'd feel my butt shift back a little bit and I had to then clamp down the core. Just kind of had to keep putting that little extra mental exercise in to get myself from sliding back. So I do think a gripper seat cover or rib cover or something would be massive on this bike. I actually know one of the guys got to try one in at the end of the day and they said it was a straight up game changer for them. The bike does come with Pirelli MX32's front and rear. The unique part is it does have a 110/90/19 rear tire. There is only one other 450 in the class that has that. That is the Triumph 450. I find that as a unique one. It does work in this situation with the bike having a soft power character. So it does allow it to spool up a little bit quicker. And I don't know if I would actually go to a 120 rear tire on this bike. And this comes down to one other unique thing I was getting used to with the bike. And it was honestly something I was scared to be predispositioned about. So the engine layout, the Desmo has a lot of components up high because the valve train is taller, and I was a little bit worried about a high center of gravity feel, and I do feel it a little bit on this motorcycle. And what I mean by that is the tip in on corner entry feels a little bit heavier than some bikes like that. To get it to tip in takes a little bit more input, and it overall feels a little bit heavier on some of those rolling motions because of that. Part of that is soft power. Soft power character always, in my opinion, makes a bike feel heavier, and then that extra inertia up top kind of plays a part into that. If I went to a 120 rear tire, I feel like that lean in and stand back up character would be a little bit tougher if you had the wider tire on it. So I know most guys would probably default to going to a 120 on it. If you do get one of the Ducatis, I would recommend maybe thinking about that before you do it, or even testing a 110 to a 120 back-to-back to really see if that's the direction you want to go. Outside of that, everything else is extremely what I would consider high quality on this bike in terms of brakes, clutch, all Brembo units, all stuff we're extremely well used to. Brake functionality is completely normal, fine on this bike. The clutch functionality was good to me. Down to like the nitty-gritty of my overall based opinion. Again, ergos, I'm extremely happy with. Everything's neutral, love that. Things that could be better from an ergo side is just the seat and the grip stock. Engine, extremely free, mid to top is strong. It's the freest 450 I felt. It is the lightest 450 and potentially in the class for me under movement in terms of that mid to high RPM because it has so little inertia feel up there. It does feel easy to throw around. It is playful off jumps, things of that nature. Where it feels heavier than any other 450 for me, again, is those low RPM inputs that tip into corner, tip out because of the high center of gravity, and also the softer power character, because again, that always plays a little bit into that feel. The bike is physically light, not the lightest in the class, but one of them, but under certain parts of motion, it does feel heavier than certain bikes in the class. Suspension balance, again, completely normal for me. We're not on a rough track. I don't have much to say there. The only thing I can say is it's definitely a little bit more of a front-end input bike to a rider in terms of what you can feel on the ground. So I am curious going forward, you know, basically what the front end will be like to set up on a real rough track, whether you are in deep loam, deep braking bumps, or even if you're more like we have in SoCal, like a Glen Helen Chatter. I am very curious to see how the front end does. 'Cause again, first impressions, I'm not trying to use this too much of a cop-out, but this is a very different situation, a very different place, a very, you know, quick opinion on the motorcycle overall. But as a total, how is it for a first-year bike? I do love it. I do love the fact that they brought something different to the table, and I think that's very tough. Something we even learned from talking to Ducati's own testing staff was when they tested every other bike out there, they said compared to their on-road product that they think that the off-road market is much tighter and more competitive. They think that every bike is so close that they thought it was very hard to not only get to that level, but find things they could improve on, where they said on their street product, they find that it is easier to find more performance over another OEM's bike in certain classes. So, and I do agree with them. I think it is, the bikes have narrowed down so much that it is extremely difficult to come in and produce a bike that is on the level of somebody that's been doing it for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and not only do it, but bring something a little bit different to the table. So, final closing thoughts in terms of testing. Would I buy one of these bikes myself, even in first year? I would absolutely. If you are very interested in the Ducati, do you want to straight up, if you're going to enjoy this bike, if you like the comments I have in terms of performance, then yes, you're going to. There's nothing to me that's odd about this bike. There's nothing that sways me away from thinking that if I like these aspects of the bike, I wouldn't go buy it. I think the price is surprisingly competitive. Yes, it is the most expensive standard production 450 in the class, but at least in the US, it's only gonna be a couple $100 more than a KTM Husky. So if you're already in that budget range, you're not overextending yourself to get a Ducati, which I think is a conversation you don't have in a lot of other markets when it comes to a Ducati product. Usually they are a bit more upstream than their competition. Again, what are some of the things I really want to get back to California to learn, or just anywhere in the US where we do more of our testing? I really want to try the tire sizing. I want to learn more about the center of gravity and the setup to see if I can improve some of those things. And I'm very curious to see how the actual suspension action works when we get into some tracks that we are a little more used to. If you have any other thoughts or comments, you want to throw them in the comment section below. I try to get to answering all those. Please throw those down there. Yeah, love to hear what you guys think. And as always, thanks for watching.